She stood on the gallows with her chin high, as if the desert itself could not take from her the one thing she still owned: pride. Dawn lay thin and pale over the scrub. Ropes creaked like the dry bones of the land. Faces ringed the platform. Kin, neighbors, the men who kept custom by habit and fear. Chief Nantan's voice cut through the cold, measured as a judge's ledger. He spoke the sentence and the law that led to it, and the crowd breathed in as if they were part of the rope's patience. Ayanna felt the sun on the back of her neck, felt the rope bite into her wrists where the knot had already left its dark print. Her thinking was a slow, steady thing. She had refused once. She had struck a man who claimed what she would not give. That refusal had been a small roaring, enough, in their eyes, to demand the spectacle. In her mind, the memory of her hand raised, and the hard smack was not shameful. It was a claim. She kept that claim in the hollow of her throat like a soft stone. When Silas Boone walked forward, no one expected him. He was not a town notable, not a man who made speeches. He came like a weathered sign pushed into the dust, coat collar up against the morning, and his horse stamping like it wanted to be anywhere but here. He said plainly, "I'll take her." The murmurs rose, legalese and outrage braided together. But the law they all knew twice over allowed for exchange, name for name, claim for claim. Chief Nantan conferred with elders. There was hesitation, the old rustle of honor deciding whether to accept a stranger's hand. Then the word, "Untie her." Ayanna felt the platform under her soles as the rope fell away, and the world tilted in a slow, careful surrender. She stepped down with her shoulders straight. Her first sight of Silas was of a man whose hands bore the map of his work, calloused, stained, steady. He did not look like a savior. He looked like a man who had learned how to keep things from breaking. He put his hand out, an offer of something complicated, and for the first time in days, Ayanna let herself move. If you want to follow Ayanna's choice, like and stay with the story. They left the town with the early people's talk falling behind them like the dust from boots. The landscape went on, low ridges, sage that smelled of old rain, the pale stretch of dirt the horses ate with their hooves. The first hours were all the small mercies that make two people not strangers. Silas handing a canteen, the water cold and clean against her teeth. A strip of jerky held out without theatricality. His coat slid around her shoulders the first night, a practical warmth rather than an embrace. Ayanna accepted the coat because the cold reached into her bones. She did not accept it as debt repaid. Silas rode a little behind her, always keeping the line between them measured. He did not ask questions he did not need to ask. He watched how she sat the horse, the way she steadied her jaw when the wind pressed against her, how her fingers found a small comb tucked in a pocket and smoothed the hair at her nape like a ritual. Once, when a thorn caught the mane of his horse, she reached down and worked at it with her fingers, precise and patient. He watched and did not speak. His gratitude was a slight, careful nod. Town by town, there were eyes that followed them like small accusations. Shop windows shuddered their curiosity. Men at the saloon lowered their cups. Someone hissed about treaties and town law as if naming them could stitch the world back together. A storekeeper spat near their boots and told Silas that folks were better left to their own wrongs. Silas paid for what he took, an honest barter of coins and meat, and he moved 2 horses out of the owner's line, not in show but because a horse with its rump to the sun makes a better travel partner. The prejudice around them never roared. It was a constant, a background weather that made speech thin and travel lower. Ayanna felt it like wind on her face. It made her close the small spaces where trust might grow. She answered only when necessary. Her silence was not surrender. It was sorting. At night, she watched Silas as he worked with rope and saddle, the way his jaw tightened before the slow exhale of a man who carried grief as a weight rather than a wound. Once, bending to take a horseshoe from the pack, he revealed a white scar that cut his forearm, a thin, precise reminder of something that had happened to him before. They kept to paths that avoided the lonesome places. They made camp near a creek where the water ran bright shallow between stones that smelled like old copper. They slept with a fire between them that was small and practical. It threw back only the immediate dark. Silas put his coat over the grass once and motioned for Ayanna to keep it, She took it and folded it as if folding an agreement into a pocket. When he drew a line in the dirt on the second night, the circumference where no one would cross, Ayanna moved within it and did not resent the boundary. She measured it against her own choices. There were small things that softened like ice. He taught her how to set a tight knot that would not bite wood. She taught him how to inhale a particular scent of sage that meant rain might come. The comb, kept always at her hip, made an odd currency. Once she lost it in the grass, and he found it for her with a grunt and a half-smile that did not mock. She pressed it into the leather of her palm afterward, and for a moment the world narrowed to the two of them and the comb's teeth. When the messenger came from the tribe, he rode like a man who carried more than a road. The horse's flanks burned with effort, and his face carried the old hush that belonged to those who carry bad news in neat lines. He spoke the words as they had been written in the law and in the expectations. If Ayanna returned and consented to the marriage she had refused, the matter could be healed. It sounded like a clean thing on paper, a remedy, but the remedy was tangled with what had been taken from Ayanna already. The right to refuse, the public spectacle of the platform, the bruise behind the smile of those who watched. Inside, Ayanna's mind was a terrain of angles. To go back seemed to ask her to submit again to the thing she had refused. To stay was to accept a name she had not chosen, and all the small, heavy debts that accompanied it. The bargain that had saved her life had not necessarily bought her freedom. She felt the net of the law, the way it held and pinched and offered shelter on one side and claim on the other. Silas listened when the messenger spoke. He did not speak himself in the shouting way those from town might. He put his palm on his horse's neck and looked at Ayanna as if attempting to read the surface of water. There was no chest beating. There was simply the evenness of a man who had learned not to explain everything by raising his voice. Later, when words came, they were narrow and exact. "You can go." It was not an entreaty, it was provision. Beyond the messenger's words, the sky had turned. The first hint came as a smell, a thickened sweetness at the edges of the air, like a promise of something that had not yet been named. Birds fell quiet. The clouds built slow and heavy, not the sudden dramatic boil that cowboy tales promised, but a patient gathering that meant land and river would change their minds soon enough. The sense that the world itself was on a clock took a place in Ayanna's chest, steady as the beat of a horse. They moved to higher ground to tie horses and corral, though the word higher was relative, a ridge that kept the creek from swallowing them whole. Silas worked with a narrow, practiced efficiency, shouting minimal orders to the animals, retying lines, easing a mare back to her feet after it had tossed in the sudden wind. Ayanna moved as he directed, instinct and muscle more certain than any counsel. She found herself listening not because he demanded it, but because both of them had a stake in the animal's breath. The storm arrived like a closing wall. Rain came with the weight of metal, a sound that hammered the air into a thin drum. The creek swelled and became something with appetite. Logs and branches rode the current like messages. Horses whinnied and tossed, and a corral became a trap if the land gave way. Silas's coat slapped wet around him as he worked toward the animals, his posture a language of a man who had known this work before. Where he reached, his hands were steady as anchors. A young mare panicked and slipped toward the water's new edge. Ayanna had her bit and the bridle, her fingers closing on leather that shuddered with animal fear. The bank, slick with new rain, lost to a sudden gouge, and the mare's hind legs slid. For an instant, her world narrowed to the horse's flanks and the sound of water pounding. Silas was there, not a second too late, hand clamped on the reins, his body pressed against her weight. He hauled, the muscles in his forearm flexing under slick skin, and Ayanna, steady as a lodestar, pulled with him. The animal found purchase, and then the two of them had it. Mud and breath, and the miracle of leverage. They came back toward the lean of the fence, both soaked and bleeding a little from scratches, and the shock of it had stripped away 1,000 half-thoughts. In the brief quiet after the near loss, Ayanna saw something in Silas that she had suspected but not allowed herself to map. He had loved once, and the loss of that love had not left him soft, it had left him careful. When he lowered his eyes, a crease near his mouth tightened. He did not tell her what the grief had been, but she read the story in the careful way he checked the mare's flank for injury, as though the same gentle regard could be extended to a human. That night the rain softened to a steady percussion, and the creek hummed as if with an afterthought. Silas moved a small fire to a sheltered spot. He tended the horses with the same touch he had given the mare earlier, and Ayanna, watching, felt the pressure of decision shift in her chest. It was as if something in her had been weathered to a place where it could notice gentler things. The narrow kindnesses that are not ceremonies but work. Mending rope with fingers that knew when not to cut a strand too short. Making coffee by pouring carefully over coals and not letting it boil away. Retrieving her comb from where the wind had carried it and returning it to her with an unspoken attention. The messenger's words returned to the center of her thoughts. To go back would be to accept the old demands and to let the tribe's justice, imperfect as it was, resolve itself. To stay would be to accept a new kind of belonging. That of a man who had taken a name for her and a life that unfolded in incremental duties. The bond that had formed was not an erasure of her past, but a new layer. A court where other choices could be law. She kept thinking about the rope and the platform, and how little the spectacle had matched the quiet of every following day. Silas watched her the way a man reads weather on a horizon. He did not press. When he finally spoke of it, his words were careful as a plait of rawhide. "If you want to go," he said, "I'll see you to the trail." He said it plainly. He did not call her a possession or a prize. He had offered safety once, and now he offered choice. Ayanna felt a tide inside that was not only relief, but a recognition that had been growing, slow and patient. She thought of the life that had come before, the tribal calls, the faces in the crowd, the old stoic children who learned to clamp their mouths at the sight of a public penance. She thought of the smack she had given the claimant, a hard, clean assertion of where she would stand. That moment had been righteous, and it had carried consequence. She did not want to give it up. The bargain that Silas had made did not cancel her choice. It complicated it. It gave her another anchor, not in law, but in a man who could offer no restitution except the steady thing of his hands. When the creek calmed and the ground dried to that clean, cold smell that follows rain, Ayanna moved close to Silas and spoke in a voice low and iron-laced like well-tempered steel. "I will not go back for what they want," she said. She did not say the words lightly. She said them the way one seals a covenant. Quiet, irrevocable. "But I won't be taken as a prize either." Silas did not puff up with pride. His face softened in the way of someone who has been offered a responsibility that he had not asked for, but will not shirk. "You never were a prize," he said simply. "You were chosen by yourself." Her choice, when she made it, was neither sudden nor theatrical. It arrived like the slow gathering of stitches until fabric is whole. She chose to stay because staying meant accepting a person who had shown up and kept showing up. Water offered in hot noon, the coat at night. His presence when the horse slipped, and when the messenger asked his business. She chose him because in danger she had seen the way his grief had not hardened him beyond tenderness, but had taught him the economy of care. She chose him because, in the quiet that had settled between them, she had found not the erasure of her pride but a shape for it. A partnership that required her voice, not the absence of it. At dawn, on a ridge where the sun cut silver like a blade across the plains, they stood by their horses. Ayanna ran the comb through her hair and tucked it back into her pocket. Silas adjusted his saddle, and did not look at her with claim, but with a kind of respect that had roots in the trials they had shared. Chief Nantan's law had begun the chain of events, but it had not written the last line. The bargain that saved her life had opened a path. What followed was a map they drew together. They rode slowly into a town that watched them pass with the same compressed air that had met them earlier. But something had shifted. Not in the crowd necessarily, but in Ayanna. Her shoulders were the same, her posture unbent by spectacle. But where there had once been the sharp, isolated crest of rebellion, there was now a measured openness. She did not love with abandon. She loved with the deliberate care of someone who has restored a broken tool and found that it works better broken and mended than it ever did flawless. Silas never became a tale of a man who saved a girl. He was a man who traded his name for another form of company, and discovered that keeping a person safe required him to change. He learned to ask where before assuming. He learned the economy of small mercies. Ayanna, for her part, kept the right to say no. She kept the scars and the memory of the day she stood on a platform and refused to be reduced to shame. What grew between them was not the sudden conflagration of romance, but the slow heat of a steady hearth. In the months that followed, their life settled into the pattern of ordinary care, mending fences, coaxing stubborn mares back to calm, sharing the silences that only two people who know the contours of each other's sorrow can hold without filling them with words. When she braided her hair, he would occasionally find a bit of lint or a splinter and pluck it away with a tenderness that was not showy but exacting. Once, when a child in the village asked her why she had stayed, she answered simply, "Because I chose it." It was not a denial of the bargain's beginnings. It was the cleanest truth she could tell. The image that lasted was not one of rescue on a platform, but of hooves in dust that rose and fell and rose again, of a horse's flank pressed to a rider's thigh in a morning breeze, of a comb tucked into a pocket alongside a pair of gloves. Love arrived as a ledger of small acts, water handed without fanfare, a coat wrapped around cold shoulders, a horse steadied at the edge of a wash. It was unexpected because it arrived quietly, not by spectacle, and it was courageous because it honored her right to decide. They did not erase the past. They lived with it, the rope's faint ghosts and the platform's shadow softening under the sun. Ayanna's rebellion had been the first line of the story, an insistence on selfhood that set the world in motion. In the end, her choice sealed the next. To remain not because she was claimed, but because she chose to stand with the man who had learned how to keep what mattered from breaking. If the world judged them for it, they leaned into their work and the steady, patient building of a life. If this slow burn rescue moved you, subscribe for more short historical tales.